Hi, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Unmistakable. Today, we have the pleasure of interviewing Professor Kevin Knuth. Kevin Knuth is a professor of physics at the University at Albany and is the editor-in-chief of the journal Entropy, MDPI. Knuth is a former NASA research scientist, having worked for 4 years at NASA Ames Research Center in Intelligence Systems Division. He has over 25 years of experience in applying Bayesian and maximum entropy methods to the design of machine learning algorithms for data analysis applied to the physical sciences. His current research interests include the foundation of physics, inference and inquiry, autonomous robotics, the search for and characterization of extrasolar planets, and unidentified aerial phenomena, UAPs, UFOs. Knuth has published over 100 peer-reviewed publications and has been invited to give over 100 presentations in 18 countries. Without further ado, let's welcome our guest. So, Professor Knuth, thank you very much for being here and accepting our invitation. It's a real honor and pleasure to be able to sit down with you and talk about such fascinating topics as UFOs, UAPs.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
You are one of the most interesting and unique voices in the scientific community, and also related to UAPs. I think that I've heard ideas, concepts, and hypotheses from you that I haven't heard, honestly, from anybody else. So I'm thrilled to have you here and ask you some questions. In our previous presentation, we haven't mentioned that you are also one of the lead scientists of uapx, which is a non-profit organization based in Florida that studies UAP through a sensor suite, a very advanced sensor suite. So let's start from there. And would you like to update us on your activities with uapx or whatever you may want to let us know?
Yeah, certainly. UAPX, we're in for me, it's an exciting team. It's an exciting team of scientists, and it's currently led by Gary Voorhees, who was one of the Navy veterans who was involved in the 2004 Nimitz encounter. And I'm especially excited because we have in our group, we have basically 3 of us from the University at Albany. We have myself and Professor Matthew Shadagas and Professor Cecilia Levy. And so we're all colleagues at the university, but we're now all working together to study UAPs, which is really refreshing. It makes the academic atmosphere a lot more friendly, and I have compatriots now, so it's not just just me against academia or whatever. So this is a very good thing, and we're our mission is to collect our own scientific data on UAPs. We don't want to rely on other people to collect the data. We're scientists ourselves, and we're experienced with collecting data in various types of experiments. And so this is, one way to look at it. This is another experiment, right? And and in this way, we can ensure that our equipment is, well characterized. Our equipment has been calibrated correctly, and we know how to use it. And when we do see something unusual, we can be confident in that it's unusual. And then I think that's a big deal, because otherwise, the only information you ever get is some video released to YouTube, which you don't really have knowledge of the provenance of that video. You don't really know much about the conditions under which the data was collected. Usually the data wasn't collected in an ideal situation. You either have from a citizen who happened to see something. Usually it was, I was filming this and then I saw this, right? Yeah. And so it wasn't noticed right away. Or you have some of the military, videos that now have been released. We don't really know what the situation was around that either. This is a video filmed by a drone in Mosul, Iraq. Well, what was the drone doing? What was what are the drone's capabilities? What is the camera like? We can't talk about any of that. So we don't know what the instrumentation is. We don't know what the situation was, what was going on when this, metal sphere was observed, say, for that example.
Yeah.
Where did it go? What was its flight path? What was, but none of that's released. You just get a video with a few snapshots of a metal sphere moving through. And it's very easy for a skeptic to say, oh, that's a Mylar balloon, or that's a, God knows what that is. But that's really the situation we're in. And so it's much better to have, we're aiming to have a team of scientists actually out there actively collecting data. And we're now it's very good because we're not lonely anymore. We have other projects with other scientists who are involved, and we know each other. We communicate. We share information about each other's sensor suites and are working to improve things, which is what science is all about. I mean, science is about sharing information, putting our heads together to try to solve this problem, and so. So I'm good friends with Wes Waters, who is and Avi Loeb, who are on the Avi Loeb's Galileo project. There's the IFEX project in Germany, Hakan Kayal. We have the Vasco project in Sweden with Beatrix Villarreal, and many others. And the number of scientists involved is growing. So I think this is an exciting time.
Yeah, that's really great. And actually, you made me think when you were talking. I had a question about debunkers and skeptics in general. You said in one other interview that science, of course, relies on deduction and inference of reality. So there's no smoking gun most of the time in science. And it seems that the only thing that could convince a bunch of people in a UAP community is the ultimate video, showing the alien coming
Exactly.
down and say,
I've joked that the only thing that's really going to convince people, the public in general, is if you had one of these things land in Central Park and you dragged an alien off of it kicking and screaming on live television. That's the only thing that would convince some people. And I see that. And, we also hear, often hear about, where's the smoking gun evidence? But in science, there isn't smoking gun evidence. That's very rarely the case. We have, I do research in exoplanet studies where we're studying planets around other stars. And the data there is very far removed from actually imaging a planet in most cases. How do we know that there are planets out there? Well, because there are planets here. The planets in our solar system are the smoking gun that there are planets, but whether there's planets around another star, you don't have smoking gun evidence. Usually if you go to the NASA websites or where they keep track of the exoplanets that we know about, you'll see that there's a list and they tell you how many candidates there are and how many are confirmed. And getting a candidate is when you get a piece of, some scientific information that suggests that there's a planet there. But confirmation, usually you don't move to confirmation until you have evidence from multiple sources. You need simultaneous evidence from multiple instruments, multiple types of detection. And it isn't until that case until you have confirmation.
Of course. And I also think it's very interesting what you said about collecting your own data and not relying on pre-existing data. Or for example, I spoke a month ago with Michael Vaillant from who work with the GEPAN, which is the organization in France.
Another great group. I didn't mention them, but another great group. Yeah, certainly.
Yeah, and for example, he was saying, I wasn't aware of that. He was saying that he's trying to create a software that will be able to share data information with also other scientists and other organizations. And he was saying that basically scientists are not aware that this data exists, that there is data that is, of course, was collected in a scientific way, in a correct way. And but of course, the strange phenomenon that he described is said that there's a pattern in which like the data is collected and then never studied, you know. I mean, a lot of they collected a huge amount of data and then nobody really analyzed those data. And I think that's something that we have seen through all history. Basically, there's a lot of projects coming and going, and we don't really know what they did, and if somebody is, you know, just getting the material and really studying that. So I think the starting from scratch, like you said, with like independent organization is probably the key to solve this mystery.
I think having multiple organizations, multiple groups of scientists trying to study this is really going to make a big difference.
Yeah.
First, it makes it hard to stop, which, I mean, we're all in different countries. You know, you aren't going to easily stop people from studying this at this point.
Yeah.
And we don't have to rely on a given government to disclose to us, right? Whatever that disclosure might mean. I mean, at this point, we've been told, we've been fed so much misinformation and had so much information withheld that it's hard to trust anything that they say. Yeah. So I mean, to be honest, if there was, you know, if President Biden showed up on TV tomorrow and disclosed that they have crashed craft and aliens, I'm not 100% sure I'd believe it, right? I mean, this is where we're at. I mean, this is the problem that happens when you start lying, right? You become untrustworthy, and I think that's a difficulty.
Yeah, and I think science and philosophy and also people talking more and more about the topic and getting you know, open-minded about the idea that something more could be possible, you know, that would probably help the conversation to grow. But anyway, you also, I know from other podcasts that you are there's a paper coming, an upcoming paper called titled "Evidence Suggesting that Some UAPs Are Advanced Non-Human Craft." If I'm correct with the title. And I love to ask you about which are the core topics of this paper. I found them really fascinating.
That paper is difficult because for two reasons. Well, I've given now given basically two talks, two presentations where I excuse me, present that material, that information, you know, in the form of a talk. And I worked to write that up as a scientific paper. And I found that once I started, I couldn't stop. And it is now, the paper exists, it's not complete, but it's about 75 pages long, which is not a scientific paper. Scientific papers are short, you know, short pages to the point, you know, present the evidence, make your inferences, state your conclusions. But as I worked on this, I started realizing there's really a lot of circumstantial, I'll call it circumstantial evidence, because there's not smoking gun evidence, right? There is a lot of information and data out there that suggests that we're dealing with non-humans at this point. And I think that's an important message to get across, which is why I've presented it, and I aim to write a paper on this. But I found it hard to hold back, because once I started realizing, well, what are the various topics? I mean, so I can summarize the paper this way. What do I talk about? What is the evidence? And, you know, one of the pieces, when I started writing this up, I realized one of the strongest pieces of evidence seems to be the fact that we have UFO, and I'm going to use the word UFO instead of UAP. We have some idea. We know that these are objects. People have reflected lasers off of them. We have scientific data of people reflecting lasers off of UFOs. It's an object, and it's flying, and it's unidentified, so that works. But there have been UFO incursions at nuclear weapon sites, you know, since we've had atomic energy. And this is common. This is a problem here in the US. This is how I first heard about UFOs, were the nuclear weapon site incursions at Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana, where the UFOs are actually flying over and shutting down the nuclear weapons. I heard about that in the 1980s when I was a graduate student. I heard about it from a physics professor when I was a graduate student at Montana State University. And at the time, I didn't believe it, but it wasn't until years later, around 2015, that I happened to watch a press conference held by Robert Hastings, where he had 6 or so Air Force veterans and contractors who had worked at Air Force bases talking about UFO incursions at nuclear weapon sites. And just year ago during Mardi Gras, we visited my family, my wife's family down in Louisiana. And I was chatting about this. We were grilling outside, and I was chatting with my wife's Uncle Matt, and found out that I didn't realize this. I knew he was in the Air Force, but he was at Malmstrom Air Force Base.
Wow.
And I asked him, I said, when were you there? And he said, 1971. I said, did you know anything about the UFOs? He goes, oh, we all knew about that. That was all going on since the 1960s. And he knew all about it. And he said, everybody at the base knew about it, right? How is this common knowledge at the Air Force Base, but it's not common knowledge everywhere else? And what impressed me when I was writing that section of the paper was that SCU, the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies, another group down in Alabama, with Rich Hoffman, and I had written papers with Robert Powell and Peter Reale before. They're all with SCU. They had put out a report on incursions at nuclear weapon sites. And what I found remarkable about that was that the incursions weren't just associated with the weapon sites or the nuclear material production, but it was also associated with the plants that were involved with creating these things in Washington and in other places, and Washington State, that would have been. And the UFO incursions started when they started constructing the facilities.
Yeah, that's very.
Wait a minute. How does that happen? And they're showing, and in this paper, they show statistically that you have an increased amount of UFO activity here, but not in the nearby populated areas. So they're clearly interested in this plant. And what does this suggest? It doesn't suggest aliens. What it does suggest is it suggests that there is some kind of activity, intelligent activity of surveillance and monitoring going on. There's clearly intelligence, surveillance, and monitoring happening. And that's what I found to be the most interesting point. So it's not, and of course, we don't use the term extraterrestrials anymore or aliens anymore. And this happened with the involvement of the US Congress. We now use non-humans.
Non-human.
And why is that? Because because UAP now technically stands for unidentified aerial and underwater phenomena, or
anomalous phenomena,
right? Anomalous
whatever,
phenomena. Right? And but it also includes underwater phenomena. And so the issue is, to prove something's extraterrestrial, you would have to prove that they come from another planet.
Yeah.
Which presumably would require knowing which planet they came from and being able to identify, yes, they come from this planet because the biology on this planet is similar to their biology. And that would be a closed case. That's not going to happen with what we're dealing with here. So we're not going to easily be able to prove they're extraterrestrial, but the fact is they're not coming from another planet every week. In fact, this was one of the arguments that Carl Sagan put out against UFOs years ago.
Yes.
He said, I find it hard to believe that you've got interplanetary, interstellar visitors arriving at Earth every other week.
Absolutely.
And I read that quote and I thought, oh, Carl, you were so close. One more step and you would have had put it together. And that is, they're not coming from another star every other week. They live here.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
They live here. And this is why we call them non-humans now, because we don't know what the situation is. Are they originally extraterrestrial, and did they come to Earth some time ago? Or did they evolve here like us? You know, do they live in our oceans and are evolve here and are also Earthlings? We don't know what the situation is. Or is it something else, right? We've got to keep all the hypotheses on the table until, you know, science is about ruling out hypotheses. So you keep them all on the table until you've ruled them out. You don't just throw away the ones you think are silly. Who are you to decide what's silly?
Well, that would be even more like exceptional and interesting, because I mean they are not coming from elsewhere. They really live here under our nose, and we never realized that.
And that's really the shocking news of the day. Actually, if you really sit down and go through this and compare, you know, go through what was known in the 1970s about UFOs and what's believed then and what's believed now. The shocking news is that we share this planet with another intelligence that we're not aware of.
Yeah.
There is somebody else here and another player on the planet who, you know, who has some say in what happens here. Yeah. And that's a game changer, and it's interesting.
Yeah, actually, I thought the same when you know, I was thinking about Roswell and many other crashes that apparently took place after a nuclear explosion, you know, and you think that, of course, extraterrestrial could see the explosion maybe from outer space and come here to see what's going on. But I don't think, of course, I'm not a scientist, so you could tell me if that's true or not. But I don't think that maybe a nuclear explosion should be maybe so such a problem, such an issue for a civilization that lives like so far away, like light years from our Earth. So maybe why should they be so interested in us not messing up if they live so distant from us? So I don't know if a nuclear, of course, explosion could provoke consequences also to the whole universe, but if they live here, that's another story.
Right, that's definitely true. Yeah,
yeah.
And I think that's the situation we're dealing with. I mean, part of the way you can argue that they're from here, coming from here, is the fact that when there is an event like massive troop movements or an accident like the Fukushima nuclear power plant with the tidal wave, or even Chernobyl. This happened during Chernobyl. You had UFOs showing up pretty much the next day. So they're you know, coming into the area of interest within 24 hours. Now, okay, yeah. So yeah, let's let the person who says, well, they have warp drive, so they can fly very fast. Okay, fine, you can have that. But the fact is that it will still take the information about the event has to travel outward to wherever they are.
That's great.
So you know that if it happened within 20, and if they can get here instantaneously, then it still took 24 hours for that information to travel out. So they can't be coming from more than one light day away.
Yeah. Wow.
And we know this. And so what exists in our universe within one light day? Well, it's our solar system. That's basically it. So they have to be coming from within the solar system, and the most likely place is Earth. Earth is the most interesting place in the solar system anyway. This is where the action is. So
I love that, where the action is.
Literally. So
yeah. And actually, I also, there was the next question. You said, well, you already said in, I need to read this in your presentation at Max Planck's Institute, that out of 1 million possible civilization, you calculated 1.7% of colonizing civilization could have found Earth, and those civilizations would be millions of years old, and they should have arrived here 375,000 years ago, if I'm correct. So that those would be, in your opinion, possible extraterrestrial visitors, not all the two things could be connected together.
Right. We really don't know if we're dealing with multiple phenomena here. UAPs are not one thing.
Yeah.
and there are clearly already multiple kinds, and it's not clear that I mean, certainly they're not all alien spacecraft. They're not, they, and even if they were, you can't, I am often asked the question, well, how does the UFO fly? You know, how do the engines work? And you can't answer that because there may not be a single answer. It's like asking, how does a car work? Well, there are gasoline engines, there's diesel engines, which are different. There are electric engines, there's hybrid cars, you know, and there's so they can be different. And so when we don't know that we're dealing with a single species here, there might be multiple occupants here on Earth that we don't know about, or multiple visitors, whatever. But the numbers you were quoting come from some research that I did. I've been doing over the last 2 years, and that is to deal with kind of trying to make, which you were mentioning earlier, how a lot of the work of scientists is trying to get your head around the whole problem and trying to make connections. And that's one of the things that you need to do to change people's worldview.
Yeah.
And this was one reason why scientists have a hard time getting on board with this, because you're just going to have to change the way you think about everything. Oh my God, aliens could come here, really? And they could be real. And, you know, there's a lot to swallow. So one way to do this is to create bridges, to make it more plausible in the person's mind, or more reasonable, or point out that it is reasonable for certain things to be true. And a lot of that's been happening, you know, over the last 20 or 30 years with our studies in astrobiology, in the, you know, appreciating the fact that there could be life on other planets. We also now, the exoplanet studies show that there are planets around other stars, and 1 out of 5 stars has a planet in what we call the habitable zone, where you have liquid water on the surface, which is amazing. I mean, go out tonight. Here it's cloudy here. We just had a snowstorm, but here in Albany, New York. But go out tonight and go look at the stars and count out 5 stars. Pick out 5. One of those stars has a planet that has weather conditions like Earth, or temperature like Earth, right? Could have liquid water on the surface. Now we know that, and that's amazing. So the project I was working on was to try to create this bridge, and it was to try to deal with this question about how hard interstellar travel is. You always hear people saying, "Oh, it's impossible. It'll take thousands of years, and you can't do it." Nobody would do it. Is the thing people say. I'm like, wait a minute, nobody would do it? Wait,
Why?
and those people, and I've heard scientists say that, those scientists aren't aware of what's actually happening in our scientific work. One of NASA's goals is to get a probe to the nearest star, to Alpha Centauri, by 2069, by the 100-year moon landing anniversary.
I read
That's one of our goals, and we're working toward that. So we're working to be interstellar with probes, but they're going to be small probes and whatever. But it still counts.
They talk about quite a lot of probes. I don't know if the information is
It would
correct.
be a bunch of probes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So we also wonder why there are so many UFOs here, but it's the same thing.
It could be the same thing, yeah. And so the idea was to try to bridge this gap. Is interstellar travel really that hard? Is it impossible? And so I started doing simulations. I thought, well, let's simulate it. I know my physics, so I'm going to simulate a civilization. I'm going to give them a random capability, and then see if they can actually colonize other star systems. And to my surprise, it turned out that it's not that hard. It is hard. It's very hard, but it turns out that it's not improbable, and that was the important point. The main, there's one feature that seems to that can cause problems, and that is, one, if they don't have the capabilities for space travel or to travel fast enough, that rules out a lot of interstellar travel. And the second problem is if you are in a star system that is very far from other star systems. more than 4 or 5 light years. So fortunately, we've got Alpha Centauri 4 light years away, or Proxima Centauri is about 4 light years away. You've got Barnard's star, which is about 6 light years away. We've got several stars within a 10 light year radius, and so that puts us into the category where, yes, it's possible for us to actually do this, if we wanted to, right?
Of course.
And so I ran these simulations. I simulated about 2 million civilizations, and I found that about 1.7% of them actually are very capable at colonizing other star systems. And as long as the will is there, that could happen. And so then the question is that you can use those simulations to inform you as to what your expectations ought to be. Right, that's the hard thing. And the hard thing is, I know my physics, so, but I don't believe that. Well, is that possible with the physics that you know? Well, you simulate it, you show that that's actually possible with the physics you know, so you should be believing this.
That's very
And
important.
that's actually what the point of that research is. And I realized in the course of that work that if I kept track of who finds Earth in my simulations, then I could actually look at the statistics to see what characteristics they have. And that's where that comes from. So I found that, about 1.7% of the civilizations that are spacefaring and can colonize other star systems will find Earth. And so, that's a small percentage, but now that leads you to another thing like a Drake equation. So if you ever discover that somebody found Earth here, that they're only part of the 1.7%. That there's 98.3% of the other civilizations are out there that didn't find Earth. That there's many more out there.
Yeah.
And that's interesting too. So what do you find? You find that first you need to go fast. You need to be able to travel some percentage of the speed of light. Maybe up to 20% is still a little slow, but if you are a species that doesn't mind waiting or taking some time to get there, you can do it. So 20% the speed of light will work. Of course, the faster you go, the better. The more you can colonize. Acceleration has a lot to do with it, but as long as you can accelerate at a rate that will get you up to a 20% the speed of light or more, you're in business. And so that's one thing I found. The second thing is that they are probably not coming from too far away on the galactic scale. How far away? On the average, something like 6,000 light years away originally. That's a long ways. I mean, I'm not saying too far away, but we're talking about a galaxy that's about 85 light years across. So 6,000 light years, 85,000 light years across. So 6,000 light years isn't that far on that scale. And then the other thing is because it takes a long time to perform this colonization, the nearest stars, and you propagate outwards and kind of diffuse through the galaxy. You can estimate how long ago would they have first discovered Earth on average. And just looking at the statistics from the simulations, it came out to be a long time. It was about 300,000 years ago. So very probably, if you find that there is an extraterrestrial civilization that knows about Earth and has been here, then very probably they've originally discovered Earth about 300,000 years ago, which means that they've been here throughout human history, which is, basically what we observe. And so if UFOs are related to extraterrestrials, then this is what we've observed. And so that's interesting.
From there. I also think one of the main objection to the extraterrestrial hypothesis, at least as I know, was always the fact that these alleged extraterrestrial were very similar to us. They share two ends. of course, two eyes, nose, feet, and so, of course, from a scientific point of view, that would make no sense, probably, or little sense, thinking of somebody coming from outer space. But these ultra-terrestrial hypotheses, they call it somehow they refer to this Earth hypothesis as ultra-terrestrial. And it could probably explain something like this, because they would look very similar to us, probably, if they share the same planet, the same origin. What do you think about that?
Those are good questions, and I think that you have to look to other examples to find good answers. So for example, my brother loves making things. He's an artist, and he was making some mechanics for a throttle for his flight simulator, but he was actually building this thing physically and 3D printing it. He designed it, but he had to put switches in it and designed it, and he wanted to have that for his video game, and he made it. Nice. Right, just because that's what he does. He can just design things and make them, which is a fantastic skill.
Wow. Absolutely.
and he sent me photos of this last night, actually, and he showed me his design, and it's a nice design. And then he was poking around online, and he found the specifications for a real throttle on an airplane, and he on that kind of similar airplane, and he looked at that, and it was very similar. It was almost the same as his design.
Wow.
And he pointed out that surprised him. But then the more he thought about it, he thought, well, it almost has to be this way, because you need two switches to be able to monitor this and this. You need to hold the throttle in place once you've moved it. So you're going to need some kind of cog on the bottom and this. And he said, so of course we had to have a similar design, because we're trying to do the same thing. And you see this with evolution all the time. We call it convergent evolution right here on Earth. Fish, ichthyosaurs are reptiles. They look like fish. Whales and dolphins are mammals. They look like fish. They all look alike. And penguins aren't that far off, right? They're a little far off, but they have the same body shape, right? And why? Because you're trying to solve a certain problem.
Yes.
And with those constraints on behavior and function, there's only a few solutions that are going to work. 2 eyes are better than 1, because you'll have binocular vision. You can see better. 5 eyes are overkill. You don't need that many. Maybe a spider does, but typically you don't need that many. 4 legs are good. You don't need 6 legs. 6 legs are too many. It takes too much energy to keep all the stuff alive, and there's too much to move around, too much extra stuff to control it. So you don't need 6 legs. 4 is good. 4 is better than 2. It's more stable. 2 is not very stable. So 3 would be better than 2, but 3 is a little difficult, right? So 4 is better. And so that you have design constraints all the time. And you don't want your eyes below your mouth, because food's going to fall in your eyes. So that's not going to work evolutionarily. So your eyes are going to be above your mouth. And I think that's really the situation we're dealing with here. You're going to, it's fun to fantasize about what weird forms other alien life might take. But how many of those forms are going to be able to make a spaceship?
Exactly.
I mean, octopi are intelligent, but they don't build spaceships. Dolphins are intelligent. They even have names for each other. They don't make spaceships. And they're not going to make spaceships. You're not going to see dolphins flying, unless you're reading a Douglas Adams book. You're not going to see dolphins in space, right?
Absolutely.
So I think this could be an explanation of what we're seeing. It might not be so surprising that many purported extraterrestrials are humanoid-like. Our form is really good for getting around, doing things, building things. You know, we're good at
Absolutely.
building things and
Mhm.
making things, and the two free hands is very efficient. And I
Yeah.
think that's what you're going to see forms like that rather more often than not. And that's the way I look at it, at least.
Yeah, very interesting, very inspiring. And actually, I think that this topic is so important because it really makes us understand a lot more about ourselves and about life and about the place where we live in. Because both way that would be very interesting to see. Both explanation would be very interesting. Maybe they are like us because we share the same place, or there are common things in all universe. If you want to explore, if you are an intelligent beings, if you want to build things, you need that. There's no other
Right.
way to do it. So I think both ways are really this whole topic of UAP is not just for UFO enthusiasts, like they are called all over the place, but it's a
Right.
really important scientific topic,
Yeah,
in my
another good example of convergent evolution is the evolution of the eye. Eyes have evolved multiple times, in animal history, and so there are multiple kinds of eyes, and but they all have many of the same similarities because they have to have the same function, and to work
Okay.
efficiently, there's only a few ways to do it.
Okay, and in which way did they evolve? For example, I think about some witnesses of experiencer that talks about how peculiar the gray alien eyes are, and they look like many times they associate them with cat eyes or owls and this kind of stuff. So they seems closer to animals than humans. What's your take? I mean, that would make any sense?
Yeah, well, this
Yeah,
gets
of
into
course.
a difficult area of
Yeah,
conversation
because
because you have to
we don't have data about
we
that.
would yeah we don't have actual data.
Yeah,
We have anecdotal evidence, which is information.
yeah,
People will often, serious scientists will often say, well, those are anecdotes, that's not really data. Well, all data is really an anecdote. You're taking an anecdote of what a scientist said that he or she
yeah,
measured in the lab. That's an anecdote too.
yeah.
Um,
Somehow.
People who study psychology study anecdotal data all the time, or sociology. That's all they can
Yeah,
study.
yeah,
So that's not entirely fair. Okay, so fine, don't call it data. I'll call it information. A good friend of
yeah,
mine has once said, I find myself sufficiently intelligent that I can learn from anyone. And I thought, oh, that's a good quote.
yeah.
and,
Absolutely.
and the thing is that I can learn from information. I don't need a smoking gun evidence. I don't
Yeah,
need scientific data all the time. I can learn from other information too. And that's how I think about these accounts. And
yeah,
Professor Gary Nolan at Stanford, I recently saw, he had an interview and he referred to anecdotal data as preliminary data, which I thought, oh, that's very nice. It's
yeah.
it's
It's a very nice word.
preliminary data that can serve to get your attention on what you should be looking at more closely, right? And maybe working harder to get more careful information, collect information more carefully. So yeah, so to discuss what, people observe or claim to observe with so-called gray aliens and things, that can be very difficult. And
Yeah, of course.
and I don't know what to make of these observations. Some of them get very strange very quickly and very hard to believe.
Hmm.
You have the large black eyes, the large almond-shaped black eyes, the fact that when people say that they look into the eyes, they feel hypnotized or mesmerized. There's a phenomenon that they describe as eye locking, where you can't turn away from the eyes, you stare at them and can't. Now, is this
Yeah,
a human thing where, you're so fascinated by the fact that the eyes are different that your brain is just stuck somehow?
of course.
Or is this something going on with them? But there's also the stories of the telepathic communications, thoughts coming into their head, imagery. And of course that I find hard to believe too, because during my postdoctoral work, I worked mainly in the field of neuroscience, and I worked in brain-computer interface. Human brains are different, so different from each other. You can't just take one algorithm to analyze data from somebody's brain to do brain-machine interface and then apply it to somebody else's brain. That doesn't work. So this idea that you can have an extraterrestrial that can somehow link into your brain, that's, to me, seems very strange. We can't even do that with computers, with all of us being human. So I find that hard to believe. And so, but yet this is what is commonly reported. Hundreds of people, thousands of people, very probably. Professor John Mack from Harvard had studied, people who had claimed to be abducted, and he had collected a lot of information about this, and that I find that fascinating. So fine, it's hard to believe. Let's play with it and what can we make of this? So I'm not convinced that it's necessarily biology. And we don't know how much of what we observe with, if we were to encounter an extraterrestrial, it would be hard to interpret how much of that's biology and how much of it is technology, what we call technology. I mean, an extraterrestrial observing me said, wow, they have metal on their faces with glass in front of their eyes, right? Sometimes. Some of them do, and they don't all have that. It's very strange. Maybe they're two species, they could have all these weird conversations. But the answer is it's technology. It's technology that we designed, that we supplement, we supplement ourselves with or enhance ourselves with. And this could very well be the case with some of these, if we encountered extraterrestrials as well, or even use the term ultra-terrestrials, right? Which is another term meaning basically to describe another intelligent life form that perhaps lives here or something like here, right? It's a little more, that's a little more of a vague term. But I suspect, and you also have the strange, again, very hard to believe, and I think this is some of what turns serious scientists off, are the claims of paranormal phenomena occurring when you have a UFO encounter. That's incredibly common. That happens all the time. And in fact, I'm in touch with a team of researchers, they're engineers who are collecting scientific data. And they were collecting last summer, and they had paranormal things happening while they were collecting the data. And while they would see a UFO, and then they would have weird stuff happen, and they would take photographs of the weird stuff, and it's really weird. It doesn't make any sense at all. I don't want to describe it because this is their research, and but it doesn't make sense. And so here's a hypothesis that I've kind of put together listening to this. We know, scientists know that we don't know everything. We don't like to say that, and I think that a lot of scientists don't have a hard time dealing with that fact. There's a lot of people who think we've pretty much figured everything out. That's a general feeling that you get in science, but that feeling has been around since the 1700s. And then there's always a surprise, right? When we find out we didn't know half of things, right? So, around the 1800s, there were a lot of scientists lamenting in the 1880s and 1890s that, well, now we pretty much figured everything out. We just have to, clean up the little bits, these little mysteries around. And it turns out those little mysteries can be quite huge. One of the things they couldn't explain, they couldn't calculate the heat capacity of crystals. And it turns out you need quantum mechanics to do that. And they couldn't get the black body radiation spectrum right. Well, that requires quantum mechanics. The speed of light acts kind of funny. The speed doesn't change depending on how fast you move toward the light source. Well, it turns out you need relativity to understand that. So there are things that, that in the past when we thought we knew everything, turned out there was a lot we didn't know. And we're in that situation now. Again, a lot of scientists will say we pretty much know everything. That I don't believe that at all. I think we're just beginning, actually. And we do have hints of things that we don't understand. We know, we call it dark energy and dark matter are great examples.
Yeah.
We know that 85% of the universe is made of stuff that we have no idea what it is. So if that's the situation, you can't say that what you're basically saying is we pretty much understand 15% of the
15%.
universe.
Exactly.
Good for you. That's there you go.
Absolutely.
But you then can't say that you know everything. So let's just hypothetically say, let's say some of this paranormal stuff, some of this really weird stuff that we don't at all understand and has never been studied, properly studied or carefully studied. I shouldn't say never been studied because there are scientists who have tried to study it quietly, but it's never been widely studied. And so, things like psychic powers, telekinesis, I can just name any paranormal thing you can think of, just throw it in the bin. We don't know anything about that because that hasn't been widely, seriously studied. So here's the big what if some of that or some aspects of some of those phenomena are real? Then that means we have some gaping hole in our knowledge that we're just not aware of, mainly because we haven't looked at it, right? So what if you are a more advanced species, and you were aware of those phenomena? You could very well use them as part of your technology. So for an example, let's say electricity and magnetism.
Yeah.
We'll go back to the 1600s, with Galileo. They knew very little about, almost nothing about electricity and magnetism. You had lodestones and you could take glass on fur and pick up pieces of paper, and that's about all they knew, right? But we now understand electricity and magnetism, and we understand quantum mechanics. The two of those together is why we're talking to each other right now, or why you're able to hear me, is because of those technologies that to somebody like Galileo, he would have seen this as magic. This would have been a really bizarre phenomenon that I didn't know any of this was possible, right? And he might not understand any of it. And I suspect that's probably what we're dealing with here. If we're really dealing with a technologically advanced species or race, then you should expect to encounter technologies that are going to look like magic. And it could very well be that paranormal things happen when they're around because their equipment is making things happen. I turn on a Van de Graaff generator and you get electric sparks flying all over the room, right? That's electricity and magnetism. We understand that. But, somebody from the outside would say, wow, he turns on that machine and then all of a sudden the whole room is lit up, right? It looks like magic and looks weird. And I suspect that's what we have happening with some of these eyewitness reports. I think that one way to look at this is that you're encountering a truly advanced technology that uses phenomena that we just aren't familiar with at all. And some of this could be very fundamental that we're missing out on.
That's why it's so fascinating. I mean, science should be, at this point, all of these witnesses, radar data.
There's so much to learn here.
Yes.
There's clearly mysteries here that need to be solved. And that's, how exciting is that? That's why you go into science in the first place. That's why I got into it.
Exactly.
I wanted to, explore the universe and try to understand things, and to actually encounter a mystery is fantastic. What great fun.
Of course. But actually, thanks for mentioning this, because there was a question I wanted to ask you. I think I listened, I heard you saying in another interview that you were also studying some of the effects. Now you talked about the most, let's say, called paranormal effects, you know, but stuff like car engines, for example, shutting down, and when a UFO is close to a car, for example, and then when it's off, you know, the car just starts again. And actually, these things I remember when I was looking, you know, seeing them as a child in movies and films like Close Encounter of the Third Kind. You know, I didn't know that Close Encounter of the Third Kind and a lot of other films were informed by reality and not the other way.
Yeah, that's a little surprising, actually,
Yeah,
right?
and not the other way around, you know, and
Yeah.
many people still don't
They were
know.
actually quite, Close Encounters is quite well informed by reality,
Yes,
which
of
is
course.
a little shocking. And the car shutting down and starting up thing is an important one. That's one thing that went into the paper
Yeah.
on non-human technology. And it was when I saw Close Encounters of the Third Kind, you know, for the first time, even afterwards, I always thought that scene with Richard Dreyfuss in his truck
Yeah.
and the UFO's hovering over it, the truck shuts down, and then the UFO leaves and the truck starts itself again. And I thought, well, that's just silly. And I remember thinking that's just silly. But recently, last year, when I was going through some of the data, the observations and reports that people have, it turns out that that there's a small percentage of cases. I don't remember the numbers. I should have my stuff up here. But it's like on the order of 10% of the cases or so. People report that when the UFO is over them, it shuts their car down, but when it leaves, their car starts again.
Yeah, that's very common.
And I thought, wait a minute, people are really reporting this. And it turns out that there is a researcher in the 1980s, McCampbell, his name's McCampbell, who had looked at this, and he came up with a hypothesis that really makes sense. And this is one of these moments as a scientist when you see the hypothesis and you realize that this hypothesis explains all sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
And then you realize, well, that has to be it. this is what's going on. So his explanation, so there's a few things that are observed. One is that, and this is so the data set we were working with was with older cars, pre-computerized cars.
Okay.
So nowadays cars, ignitions and they're running the distribution to the spark plugs is all controlled by computer. But if you look at older cars, when it was done mechanically, this is the data set we're working with. And it turns out that not all cars shut down or trucks shut down when you have a UFO over them. Only gasoline-powered cars. Diesel engines don't shut down, typically.
That's very.
I think there was only one case out of like 200 where the diesel car supposedly shut down, a diesel engine shut down. But in all the other cases, diesel engines weren't shut down. But gasoline-powered gasoline engines do shut down. And the hypothesis there is that the UFO is creating such a strong electric field that it's ionizing the air. And this is, you can see this in some photographs. You can see what looks like a plasma around the UFO.
Yeah.
And where the ionization is so high, you're actually creating a plasma. And that's what it looks like. Now, this is also one reason why UFO images are always blurry, which you often hear scientists complain, why are they always blurry? Well, because of physics, that's why. Yeah. There's an actual if you're a scientist trying to solve the problem rather than debunk it, you would realize that that's evidence. There's evidence there that there's something interesting going on. And that evidence is that you basically have strong electric fields that are ionizing the air. So if you do this in near a gasoline engine, you basically are going to ionize the air. You have to ionize it to, what is it, like 10 million volts per meter or something like this. It's a lot of, but you're going to short out the spark plugs. So you short out the spark plugs, the car dies. Car can't run, right?
Yeah, of course.
It just shorts out. Now, the interesting thing that McCampbell noted was that the ignition system works by basically it uses an ignition coil. I called it a transformer in one interview, and a whole bunch of people commented, it's not a transformer, it's an ignition coil. An ignition coil is a transformer. It has a primary coil and a secondary. The secondary has many more winds, so you up the voltage from 12 volts to 1,000 volts or 10,000 volts, so you can ignite your fuel mixture, your fuel air mixture. So it's basically a transformer. Now, if the spark plugs are shorted out, then the distributor, you've got a distributor cam that goes around and makes contact with different switches, basically connecting the circuit to different spark plugs. And this will send a pulse. This will put a current through the primary coil in your ignition coil. Now, when that pulse turns off, when you turn that current off, the magnetic field collapses, and that induces a current into the secondary coil, which creates a current, or induces a current in the secondary coil, which goes to your spark plug and fires it, right? Makes it fire. So what's happening when a UFO is hovering over your car and shorting everything out? The spark plugs are shorted, so they're not working. But the cam, the switches in the distributor cam are also shorted. So you have current flowing through the primary coil. So the primary coil has a magnetic field around it. It's basically ready to go. Now the UFO leaves, you stop shorting out all the switches, but then that current stops, so the magnetic field collapses, induces a current into the secondary, which then sends a pulse to the spark plug. And so the cycle of a four-stroke engine is like 740 degrees. So it's only a small percentage of those. You're going to have the piston in the right position with a fuel air mixture ready to go. And when that spark comes to the spark plug, it makes the piston fire, which starts the car. And when I read that explanation, I was like, wow, and the math works out, and the percentage of cars that should start matches what's actually observed. I think it was like 12% or something like this.
Okay.
Yeah, it's like 12.5%, and it matches how many are actually observed restarting. And I thought, well, this is the explanation. This is the one that makes sense. You can explain that, the UFO has a very strong electric field, which is why you see a plasma, and that's why the gasoline engines shut down, but diesel engines don't, because they don't use spark plugs. And that explains why a small percentage of cars will restart after the UFO leaves.
Wow.
And yeah, it's when you dig in, when you treat these observations as evidence, as a clue to a mystery rather than just nonsense, then you can actually learn things.
Yeah.
And that's an important thing to do. That's what we ought to be doing as scientists, instead of just saying, well, that's silly. That doesn't make any sense. Well, it doesn't make any sense because you haven't thought it out. That's the problem.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the right attitude, for sure. And also talking about this flying characteristic, one of the universally known characteristic of UFOs is the absence of sound, or in some cases there are some sounds buzzing associated to UFOs, but normally witnesses do not report sound. Do you think that it could be possible, because they seem to cloak themselves also in certain cases? Do you think it would be possible to cloak sounds somehow? I mean, to use, I don't know if I'm saying just an heresy or something.
No, this is all fine. This is part of the game, right? I mean, we're trying to solve a mystery here. So you've got to look at all the clues, and that's another clue. Right? That's another clue as to what's going on, and it's not clear at all what's happening.
Yeah. So my question, sorry, is it really like due to for example, to the propulsion system, or is it something like intentionally hidden, or just using frequency that are outside our spectrum?
I don't think it's frequencies outside our spectrum, but that's a possibility that, we have to account for, which is why, we and other groups are trying to measure infrasound, which are lower frequencies than you can hear. and also ultrasound, higher frequencies than you can hear. We try to measure the whole spectrum because we don't actually know. We have to collect data on that. The most shocking times at which they don't make sounds are when they're moving so fast that there ought to be a sonic boom.
Of course.
And in some cases, they're moving, in the case of the Nimitz encounter where the tic-tacs dropped from 28,000 feet to sea level in 0.78 seconds, their maximum speed would have been in the middle of that trajectory would have been about 45,000 miles an hour, which is, that's 4 times orbital velocity. The space station's going 17,000 miles an hour. So it's going and 45,000 miles an hour is about as fast as the New Horizons probe that we sent to Pluto is going. Wow. So these things are fast, but they're doing this through the air and they're not making sonic booms. There's no sonic boom. There's no loud noise. There's nothing. And so that doesn't make sense. But it's a clue, right? So it appears that they somehow are not interacting with the air, right? There's something strange going on. They're not interacting with the air. Another clue is the high accelerations. In that case, the Nimitz case that I just described, the acceleration of the object was about 6,000 Gs. It's about 6,000 times the acceleration of gravity. So again, another clue. Yeah. But another confounding case is an underwater, a USO, a submerged object that was observed in New Zealand. I talked to a veteran from the New Zealand Navy where he was a sonar operator on the HMNZS Southland, which is a frigate. And they were basically doing exercises where they were going out of Auckland, out through the Rookie Gulf, out into the Pacific Ocean, and then would turn around and come back and watch with their sonar and see if they were followed. It was exercises which seemed to be trying to get something to follow them back. And they were often followed by small objects small submerged objects that didn't have propeller wash, so they didn't know what these were. These exercises went on in the 1980s, around 87. And in one instance, they were followed back by a large one, which didn't break away as they got closer to port. And they were in the Gulf and worried about this because it was really following them. It was about 25 kilometers behind their ship. But it was big. They beamed it to be about 150 feet wide. Wow. And at one point, they did a sharp turn at high speed so they could look at it with sonar from the side, and they found that they estimated it to be about 800 feet long. So this 800-foot-long submarine that doesn't have propeller wash, doesn't have propellers. So it's like Hunt for Red October, right? They don't know how this thing's working. They can't identify whether it's US, Russian, or whatever, or what it is. And it's big. It's a Typhoon-class submarine. The Russian submarine, they're about 600 feet long. So this is 30% larger than the largest submarine. Wow. And it's following them about 25 kilometers behind it. And at one point, they make a maneuver to try to shake it. And then the thing starts to close the distance, and it closes the 25-kilometer distance in about 30 seconds and cruises under their ship. And when it passes under the ship, it took all the power out of the ship. It drained the batteries even. They couldn't restart the ship. They were adrift for several hours and had to be rescued. They had to wave down a fishing boat and then have them contact somebody to rescue them. Wow. So this object closed that distance, close to 25-kilometer distance in about 30 seconds. So you can estimate a minimum acceleration there had to accelerate at least 5 Gs of acceleration underwater. The top speed is anywhere between 1,500 miles an hour to 3,000 miles an hour underwater. A 150-foot wide, 800-foot long craft. Yeah. What is this thing? And that's the real question. Now what's surprising is that there was no it's moving again, like it doesn't interact with the water at all.
Yeah.
Right? Just like the UFOs don't seem to interact with the air. So it's moving like it doesn't interact with the water.
So there's no
But
friction either.
yeah, there's no friction, but the sonar works.
Yeah, that's also.
So how does sonar work? Well, sonar takes a pressure wave. A pressure wave is basically molecules of water banging into something and bouncing back and sending the wave back out. So the sonar is working, which means that you are able to bounce a pressure wave off of it. You can hit it with water molecules, but it doesn't seem to be interacting with the molecules when it's moving. So what's actually happening? And that to me that's the biggest piece of evidence we've had that shows, that gives you some clue as to what could be going on. I mean, I don't have an answer for this. I have no idea how it could work. But you don't seem to have any interaction with the water. It's moving through the water almost effortlessly, no friction, yet the sonar works.
Wow.
I'm not giving up, but this is fascinating. I mean, it's fascinating account.
It's probably one of the most fascinating things ever, you know.
It is, yeah. And I think that probably would give us a bigger clue as to what's happening with the ones in the air. And of course, now the question is, well, if you can move through air effortlessly and you can move through water effortlessly, and of course, the transmedium travel is one of the 5 observables that the agent program pointed out, being able to go from air to water effortlessly, right? Can you go through solids?
Yeah, exactly.
That's the next question. Can you move through a solid without interacting with it?
Mind-blowing.
And I don't know the answer to this. I almost always, when I encounter a new person, I ask if they've seen any evidence of these things moving through solids. And there are a few accounts, like probably a handful, literally 4 or 5, where people claim that they've seen the UFO go into a mountainside, right? Not slow down, just go into it. There's a few accounts like that, but not many, and nothing documented that I know of. But that would be valuable information.
That would be really mind-blowing, I think.
That would be mind-blowing if you could do that. You could then not only have undersea bases, but you could have bases underground that they just go in and out of without doorways, right?
Yeah,
so now it's
because we should question also the reality. I mean, how can you really do that?
How can you do that? What did I miss in physics class, or what did physics class miss that allows that to happen? That's the interesting question.
Wow. Yeah, and talking about water, I'm actually stealing a lot of your precious time. So, but
that's fine. I'm enjoying myself, and it's great fun. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And also talking about water, I really loved. It was actually like a game changer for my brain when you said like that. If you are, for example, an interplanetary traveler or whatever, Yeah, I mean, water is it's an idea is to live, to to maybe have a base, and also to forge your tech, maybe. So why is that? Because from a scientific point of view, why water would be? Because I think many people assume that since we know so little about oceans, since we actually don't know them, we don't really explore them. They're very bad places for us to live. We probably assume that nobody
That's one of the biases we have as a species. We're land-dwelling species, land-dwelling air-breathing species, and so that really biases us against oceans.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, this planet, to be honest, this planet is probably next to Uranus. This planet is probably the worst named planet in the solar system. This planet we call it Earth. I mean, it's 75% of the planet's water. The planet ought to be called water, or ocean is what it ought to be called. Calling it Earth is silly, but it shows our bias, right? It really is telling, and that's borne out by the fact that we really have barely explored our oceans. In fact, when I was growing up, and even in the 70s, the story was, well, in the deep oceans, it's too dark, there's no light. There's no life down there. I remember being told that there's no life in the bottoms of our oceans. That's totally wrong.
Yeah,
We now know that's totally wrong. I mean, how many times do we have to learn that science had it wrong because they hadn't looked yet, right? Because they just assumed this is how it's going to be. We assume that aliens can't get here. We assume that paranormal things aren't real. I'm not sure that's not the way you approach science. The way to approach it is to do experiments. Try it.
Yeah, that's true.
Do experiments, take measurements. So oceans are surfaces with atmospheres are horrible places to live. You go from Earth to Mars, you're going from a planet with an oxygen atmosphere with 1 atmosphere of pressure. In fact, we use the units, 1 atmosphere of pressure, right? This is 1 is what Earth is, right? But you go to Mars and you have 1/100th the amount of air pressure. You need a spacesuit. The chemical constituents aren't right. There's no oxygen. It's carbon dioxide, which will turn into carbonic acid in your lungs and burn your lungs. Then the temperatures are all off. You go from here, which is an average, Earth's average is what, 54 degrees or something, I think is the average temperature of Earth. And then you go to Mars and you're talking about 100 degrees. And I'm describing this in Fahrenheit. So sorry for the non-Americans.
we can put a
You can figure that out maybe.
Yes.
It's a little extra work for you. Yeah, so then you're talking about 100 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit on Mars, which is too cold. And now you go to Venus. Venus is, we call it Earth's twin, right? I mean, it's the same size as Earth. Yeah. It's not that much closer to the sun than the Earth is. But you go and it has 100 times more air pressure than Earth, would crush you. And the temperature is about 800 degrees Fahrenheit.
Wow.
Surfaces are horrible places to be. Whereas if you go from one ocean to another, the fact that you have an ocean, the fact that it's liquid water means that the temperatures between 0 and 100 Celsius, right? Always. So every ocean, Europa's ocean, Jupiter's moon Europa, under the ice is a saltwater ocean 60 miles deep. Our ocean's only 6 miles deep. That's 60 miles deep.
Wow. But
what's the temperature? Well, it's liquid water. So it's between 0 and 100 centigrade. It's somewhere there's a nice place to be. And the pressures aren't that different. Water isn't compressible. So you can control the pressure by depth, right? So if you can only withstand a certain amount of pressure, you just go down to that depth and you hang out there. You don't have to go all the way to the bottom. So you can control pressure with depth. The only the difference then are chemical constituents, but if you're in a water ocean, the main chemical is water, so it's mostly water. The worrisome part would be trace chemicals, some of which might be poisonous to you, or biologics, right? Bacteria or other biologics that could be harmful to you. Those are the only things to worry about. So going from one ocean to another ocean, from one planet to another, not a big deal. So if you develop the technology to be able to live in the ocean, you can easily go from planet to planet. But living on surfaces is going to require different technology for different planets, right? You go from Earth to Mars, you're going to have to withstand low air pressures and cold. You go from Earth to Venus, you're going to have to withstand hot temperatures and high air pressures. So they would require 2 totally different technologies. But going ocean to ocean is much better.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. So our neighbors or landlords could be actually living there.
Yeah. And if they're, and so if you were colonizing other planets, your best bet would be to plan to colonize oceans. It would be the easiest thing to do, as long as you had developed that technology.
Okay, that's very, very interesting.
Which is it's just a very different way of thinking, but that's, I mean, that's the conclusion that you're led to by looking at the facts.
Yeah. Okay, so I have a very last question for you that we like to ask everybody, because we call this podcast unmistakable, either because many witnesses or people who had experience, like for example, the Nimitz encounter, describe the thing as, they know what they saw, independently of what they are told the things was, or and so normally they refer to this UFO as unmistakable. They have an experience, they know what they saw, and so but unmistakable could also be an experience. I mean, it could be a book that you read, or a study that you read, or a discovery that you made. So what was unmistakable for you, for example, on this topic? What was the turning point, or the moment you really understood that it was real?
I think for me, it was hearing about, it was my second week or so in graduate school. And I grew up in Wisconsin, which is in the Midwest US. And I went to graduate school in Montana, at Montana State University in Bozeman, which is just about an hour drive north of Yellowstone Park, which is wonderful. I mean, every time I needed a break from the university, I would just drive down to Yellowstone Park.
Nice.
It's just an hour drive. So you go down and see some buffalo and
Wow.
chill, and then go back to school. So it was lovely. And it was my second week there, which would have been it would have been early September in 1988. There was a cattle mutilation in Bozeman, in the town I was living in, on a ranch. There were 2 cows were killed and surgically messed with, right? And now that I know more about this, it was pretty typical. Their eyes were cut out, and ears, the sensory organs are removed, the sex organs are removed, and it's all done surgically. It's very strange. And I was disturbed by that. And it was all over the news, and people are, on the news are panicking because, they have to panic so that you watch the news.
Of
Oh my
course.
God, something in your cupboard can kill you. You tune in at 10 to find out what it is. Don't tell us now because it might kill us, but wait till 10 o'clock, the 10 o'clock news, and be sure to tune in so you don't miss it. So that's how the news works. The sky is always falling, and it has to be falling so that you watch the news and get to see the advertisers.
Absolutely. That's also a great point.
And keep that in mind whenever you get upset about the news. Remember, they're trying to make you upset. and
I never thought in those terms, but it really makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, they have to keep everyone upset.
Yeah.
And I think it's a bad dynamic. So this is what was happening, though. They're on the news. There were UFO sightings reported to the sheriff in Bozeman that night, and as well. And so it's all over the news. 2 cows are mutilated on a ranch. Now, for the rancher, this is a big deal. A cow is an expensive,
of course,
piece of property.
Yeah.
And so this is costly to the rancher. But on the news, it's either aliens or Satanists, right? It's one of the two. And then, of course, people like to mix the thing. Oh, alien! They're not aliens; they're demons. And come on, please. Let's try to understand what's going on here rather than making stuff up. So we were talking about this in the physics department. The new graduate students, some of us who had just moved to Montana. We just moved there. We're looking to spend 4 or 5 years there going to school. And I think, what's all going through our head is, what kind of crazy place did we just move to where cows are mutilated? I mean, I never heard of that.
Of course.
And so we were talking about this rather vigorously in the hallway, and clearly must have disturbed one of the professors. One of the professors came out of his office to find out what was going on, and we told him, and he goes, "Oh, yeah, this happens from time to time, and they investigate, and they never really figure it out." And And then they just forget about it again until it happens the next time.
Yeah.
So it didn't make any of us feel any better. It's just like, so that's all pretty useless. And then he said, but what's really strange, he says, I have friends up at the Air Force Base at Malmstrom, and they have problems with UFOs flying over and shutting down the nuclear weapons at the ICBM missile sites. And we listened politely, and when he left, we laughed because the thinking was that can't possibly be real because our Air Force would be mobilized. Everybody would be mobilized because they're messing with our nuclear weapons. I mean, you can't. Can you really get away with that? Apparently you can. So this is the surprising piece of information that I gathered from all of that. So we didn't believe it, of course. We thought that was silly. And for the rest of the year, that was kind of a running gag, is that if somebody said, this strange thing happened to me, and then somebody would go, but what's really strange is we have UFOs shooting down nuclear weapons, and then we would all laugh. And so this was part in my mind. I just remembered that this happened. And it wasn't till about 2015. So this is before the article.
The
New York Times article, which was 2017. It was 2015. I was teaching an astronomy class, and I was preparing for a lecture on astrobiology, possibilities of life elsewhere. And some of the students had wanted me to mention the possibility of extraterrestrials visiting Earth. And I don't know what to talk about. What do I say in class about that? I don't know anything. So I was just poking around on the internet to see if there's anything interesting other than the Drake equation that I could talk about. And I stumbled on the press conference that Robert Hastings held in 2010 that features Robert Salas and others who talk about their experience with UFOs shutting down nuclear weapons. And those things happened in 1966. Salas's experience was for 66. So it's 20 years before what I heard about in 1988. But I was watching this and I thought, oh my God, and then it just sank in. I thought, this has to be real. Because I heard about this, but this time I had heard about it 30 years ago, right? From another professor who said that he had friends at Malmstrom Air Force Base, people he knew well, who told him about this. And he said, he said very distinctly, I remember, he said, they are having problems, present tense. And that's 1988. And I thought, this is actually dangerous because clearly nobody believes this because we all think it's nonsense. And so nobody's doing anything about the problem. And it kind of sank in. This is why the Air Force isn't on high alert. It's because nobody believes it. But then I thought, but it has to be real. So now we are in a dangerous situation because there's something real happening that's serious that nobody believes. And somebody asked me once, what do you learn from that? And I thought, the only thing I learn is that the U.S. government's made it very clear that you can fly around our nuclear weapon sites in weird craft that we can't identify, and that we aren't going to do anything about it. That's what I learned. I'm telling on them a bit, but that's their fault. They need to get on the ball. And need to find out what's going on. And I thought, well, somebody has to study this. So I started. I didn't decide to study it at that point. I just decided to start paying attention, right? Absolutely. So I started paying attention. I started reading up on things and reading about past reports and some of the history. And the more I dug into it, I thought, well, this is actually fascinating. If this stuff, if some of this is real, any of it's real, it's fascinating. And then it was 2017, only 2 years later, that the article, came out in the New York Times. And when I saw that, I thought, oh, this is it. And I thought, I have to study this. No scientists are looking at this. This is wide open, a huge opportunity, and it's important. And I thought, how can you turn that down? It's one of the this has a potential of, being one of the biggest discoveries in human history. And actually, when I was
Absolutely.
presenting at the Max Planck Institute, one of my colleagues asked me afterwards, he said, why are you studying this? Why would you put yourself in this position to study this? You're
Hmm.
really opening yourselves up to a lot of criticism, professional criticism, and
Well,
and it could hurt your career and all this. And I said, this could be the biggest discovery in human history. How do you walk away from that?
absolutely.
If I walk away from it and it turns out it was real, I'm gonna kick myself for the rest of my life. I don't want to be in that position. My
Absolutely.
advisor was in that position, my PhD advisor. He was studying something, he was studying solar neutrinos in like the 60s. And they had a new instrument they were using, and but they were having problems because they found that the surface of the sun was vibrating.
Uh-huh.
And it was somehow messing with their measurements. I don't remember
Okay.
the details, but it was vibrating and it was messing with their measurements. So they abandoned the project.
Hmm.
And he said, we never published anything about it
Wow.
because it just meant that our intended project didn't work. And then it turned out that a few years later, there was a big discovery of sun, solar quakes, right? Solar oscillations
Yeah.
of the sun. And that became a big deal. And he was like, we knew about this 10 years
Of
ago,
course.
but we never published it, right? He walked away from it. Right. And I remembered that story and I thought, well, I'm not walking away from this story. This is too interesting.
Absolutely. And thanks a lot. I think it's very important that people like you contribute to this, and you're really an important, but you can be actually part of history, I think. So thank you very
It's
much.
great. It's great fun. And I encourage other scientists, look, if you be skeptical, that's perfectly fine. I
Of
mean, that's our
course.
job. But
Of course.
be skeptical of everybody. Be skeptical of the people who say it's nonsense too, because you need to be skeptical of them as well. They don't actually know. But look into this
Absolutely.
if you're interested, and if you want to study this, please, do. Why not?
Absolutely. Thank you very much for your time. You were very generous to stay with us 1 hour and a half. So thank you. Thank you very much, and keep us updated about your paper coming out, when it will be, and we are looking forward to read it about
Great.
your
Thank you
next
so
activities.
much for having me. It's been great fun.
Thank you.